Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Hot Topics webinar. My name is John Murray, and I'm the chair of the USTPC Accessibility Committee. Can we have the next slide, please? Move on to the next slide.
Apologies, John. Be with you in a moment.
Okay.
Forgive me, please continue. We will manipulate this momentarily.
Okay, let me just tell you a little bit about the U.S. Technology Policy Council. We are part of the Association for Computer Machinery, and a lot of our work involves assisting with public policy in the federal and state governments here in the United States. Let me just give you a little bit of housekeeping on the webinar. The event is being recorded and will be archived for public viewing online. We have live sign language interpreters on board. A quick shout out to Kat Womack and Nikki Cherry from Specialized Interpreting Services. The session is also being live captioned on the Zoom screen. If you select captioning down at the bottom, you'll be able to view that captioning. Please note that as journalists, any journalists on board, this event is being provided on background. It's not appropriate to do any direct quotations or attributions without speaking with the source and getting their prior agreement. During the session, the microphones of all attendees will be muted. You have the opportunity to participate in the chat session to reach the panelists, but not to chat with each other. We would, if there are questions to be raised, we would prefer that you use the Q&A button in the Zoom session. If you selected, the moderator will pose the question on your behalf. You can send if you need technical assistance, please send us a message to a chat message to ACM policy. Next slide.
Unclear what the issue is, John. Sorry. There we are.
There we go. As I mentioned, we're part of the U.S. Technology Policy Council of the ACM. We're very the committee, rather, and the committee is always on the lookout for additional participants. Please consider joining us at the email address shown there on the screen. Our focus is on the United States and the governments and regulations within the United States. If you are outside this jurisdiction, do please contact us anyway, and we will put you in contact with the relevant body for your region. Next slide. Specifically, the mission of the ACM is to inform the computing community and the general public about policy issues, and to provide independent expertise to policymakers and guidance on possible opportunities for rulemaking. Within the accessibility subcommittee, we've been working to raise awareness of some accessibility issues within the Department of Justice, and part of this is the purpose of this webinar. We've also been reaching out to other organizations that are also involved in this area, and collaborating with them as appropriate. I think the next slide. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to hand you over to the moderator for our session, my colleague Lorraine Kisselberg, who's on the faculty at Purdue University. She's been involved in this type of work for quite some time, and she is also a former chair of the Technology Policy Council, the Global Technology Policy Council for ACM. So, Lorraine, I think it's your turn.
Thank you so much, John. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone here. So let me say a few words before we get started, and that is that most of us know that our lives today are immersed in digital spaces and technologies, applications and information, and that we live and work in ways that require the use of digital tools. But digital spaces are not fully accessible to everyone in our society. Some may have difficulty seeing, hearing, moving, or navigating in some way in digital realms. And when these worlds are not accessible, this means people with disabilities cannot attend school, apply for jobs, work efficiently, access healthcare, pay their bills, or find information in the same ways that others take for granted. And this is not an insignificant problem. 26% of adults in the United States have some kind of a disability, and an aging population means that that number will grow. So in a statement, and I'm referencing the slide that you see on the screen here, in a statement released in 2017, ACM's US Tech Policy Committee confirmed its commitment to advance policies, practices, and research in usability, accessibility, and assistive technology. And they outlined a set of principles to assure this premise. And those principles stated that, for example, accessible technologies must extend beyond web and mobile application, that accessibility should be designed and built from the beginning, that educational resources are needed to improve awareness and increase compliance. Tools are also needed to assist developers in designing and testing accessibility, and that to foster digital inclusiveness, we have to be aware that individuals may have a range of accessibility concerns associated with mobility, vision, hearing, and cognition, as well as changes in abilities associated with aging. So these overarching principles guide our work in accessibility policy. But today we want to discuss the specific rules and standards that are in place to provide guidance to computing professionals so that they can assure their products and their content in digital spaces are accessible to all people. Now, last year, over 180 disability rights organizations wrote the US Department of Justice calling for the codification of detailed binding regulations to assure that individuals with a disability are never excluded from digital spaces that are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in this letter, led by one of our panelists today, Stephanie Inert, they called attention to the fact that while the Justice Department has long held that the ADA applies to the internet and it includes websites, it never completed rulemakings that were started in 2010 under Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA, but then withdrawn in 2017. And in the meantime, we have courts that have been trying and reaching different interpretations on when and how the ADA should apply to the internet. So this means that courts, government agencies, businesses, and computing professionals still lack clarity and enforceable regulatory standards regarding their obligations under the ADA. So in a letter to the Department of Justice, ACM USTPC noted that without enforceable rules, our online spaces will continue to include websites that are designed based on inconsistent and sometimes unsuccessful interpretations of what accessibility means. And this is an issue that's unique to digital spaces. Architects and engineers already have in place very specific codes on how to meet accessibility needs in physical spaces. Computing professionals do not. And that creates barriers to information access, education, employment, health and well-being, and more. Next slide, please. So we've invited our panelists today to discuss these issues regarding rules for web accessibility. Each of them has been deeply involved as litigators, advocates, and researchers. They include Tim Elder, who's a civil rights litigator and founder of the TRE legal practice. He has litigated, for example, testing sites that don't accommodate students and employment discrimination. And his commitment to disability rights has been awarded, and he's also a fellow of the American Bar Association. Stephanie Inrod, who is the Chief Public Policy and Research Officer for the American Foundation for the Blind, has been advocating for people with disabilities for 20 years. She started her work in government and in a nonprofit service and advocacy organization. And she was one of the leaders who brought together all of these organizations in their call to the Department of Justice. And finally, Jonathan Lazar, a professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, who directs the Trace Research and Development Center. And he's published extensively on human-computer interaction and digital accessibility issues. He was recently awarded the 2020 ACM SIG Access Award for outstanding contributions to computing and accessibility. I'm going to ask them each individually to begin our discussion by providing a brief highlight of the issues they see as most pertinent today. So let me start first with Tim.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Lorraine. So as Lorraine said, my name is Tim Elder. I'm the principal attorney at TRE Legal Practice. We're a firm that really focuses on applying the old statutes that were drafted, before a lot of the technology that we're applying it to ever existed. So we tend to look at impact and where the law is going and trends and these sort of things. I remember being a law student very early on, working on some of the very earliest cases that were dealing with the question of, does the ADA apply to websites primarily for businesses that were online and then starting to offer their traditional brick and mortar services on a website. And then little did I know how much of a topic that would explode to and really turn into a career. I'd say today we really have a scaling problem. Inaccessibility is increasing, it's not decreasing. And part of that increase is because the amount of web-based technology that is in all of our lives is increasing dramatically. It's certainly becoming an everyday part of our lives, whether you're buying groceries or voting or wanting to watch a movie or whatever. Chances are technology has some interplay into that basic aspect of society or information. On top of that, sort of compounding the problem is all of that technology that's like sinking into every aspect of our lives. The technology and the rate and pace that technology is changing is accelerating. So we have this great amount of technology, but also a great amount of very fluid technology that updates seemingly every day. The courts and the legislatures have not been able to keep up with that pace of technology implementation. And so now we have way more technology than the law or the legislature really knows what to do with. And so we're really in a game of catch up, trying to find a good set of rules and scale a set of rules that can really keep up. The law and the courts, yes, we can enforce, but there are not enough lawyers to possibly meet the demand for all of the inaccessibility that's out there in the world and that's legally enforceable today. And so that's why we're here, really to talk about mandatory regulatory standards to enforce and really promote voluntary compliance and rely less on legal litigation and enforcement compliance.
Thank you, Tim. Stephanie, would you like to give an introductory statement?
Stephanie, I'm sorry,
No.
you're muted.
You are still muted. There you go. Almost. There you are.
Okay, how about that?
There you go.
All right. In my role at the American Foundation for the Blind, I lead the Policy and Research Institute. And I really want to agree wholeheartedly with that accelerator comment that Tim Elder shared. In looking at the issue of digital inclusion and exclusion, one of the things that we really found through the research that we do at AFB is that the pandemic served as this tremendous accelerator of reliance on technology, and sometimes, technology without the interaction of humans in the process of dealing with any kind of system in your life, whether it's the education system or employment system or human services or public services. And we extracted the person that we would often deal with and put in that place technology, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But what that means is that technology and its accessibility is the real question mark. If it isn't accessible, then there are people that are without whatever that entity is offering in terms of an equitable experience. So AFB did a number of research studies during the pandemic, looking specifically at the education system and the gaps, as well as employment issues of individuals who are blind and low vision, and how all aspects of their experiences really were very, very framed by accessibility barriers. And I would love to point you directly to our website at afb.org to look in detail at some of the really shocking numbers and figures related to why internet and web and app-based accessibility issues have really truly accelerated and are deeply problematic in terms of equity for people who are blind and low vision. And so with that, I'm very excited that we're at the spot that we're at and that we gather here today to talk about something like getting the clarity that we so need to really explicitly allow state and local governments to understand and to be able to go ahead and implement a plan that will make their offerings to the public truly equitable. And so with that, I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And so last we have Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Lazar. Inaccessible interfaces, including inaccessible websites, lead to forms of societal discrimination. We tend to start thinking of this just as a technical point of view, right? About design, about technology, about coding. And we often forget about the real world impact that these inaccessible interfaces lead to, the types of barriers that they lead to for people with disabilities, right? And I've always been fascinated by that, the kind of what does it mean if it's inaccessible? So for instance, an inaccessible website, right? You have to apply for most jobs online now. If the website for the employment application is inaccessible, you either can't apply or you have to, right, find another means, identify yourself, out yourself as having a disability and say, I can't fill out the application because it's inaccessible. Right, so that's problematic. There's pricing discrimination where you're charged higher prices because you can't use the lowest, the lowest fares and the lowest prices available on websites. Discrimination in education when the materials used in classrooms are inaccessible. Now, obviously, during the COVID pandemic, we saw the impact of digital inaccessibility even more, right? Organizations moved very quickly without thinking about accessibility to build new websites, to install new apps, right? You saw this in higher education, you saw this in commerce. The goal was to pivot quickly to an all online experience. But in many cases that left out many computer users, many consumers with disabilities. As computer scientists, we tend to think of this as computer users, people interacting with an interface. But it's always very important to remember that people with disabilities are consumers who spend money, and that businesses often don't see it that way. They don't understand that, oh, these are potential customers. We need to find a way to make our interfaces accessible to bring them in as customers. Now, for over 25 years, I've been involved with human-computer interaction and digital accessibility, close to 30 years. And, I started out from the human-computer interaction point of view, but the more I got involved with digital accessibility, I saw the importance of the legal side and how so much of what was happening in the digital accessibility space was really tied in with law. And so we can create, as researchers and developers, we can create great solutions, and we can create fantastic, right, important guidelines, such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the technical standards used around the world in countries around the world, which have, right, many people know how to code using them. They're well accepted. Governments around the world use them. But yet, if we can't figure out how to ensure that the legal frameworks incorporate our best practices from computing, our impact is really limited. After about 20 years as a professor, I took a leave of absence to go back actually and study law and focus on disability rights law. Why? Because I know as a computer scientist, it sometimes is hard to understand the legal concepts. And that's why I'm so excited that, that the DOJ is moving forward on the rulemaking for Title II. And I'm excited that ACM is getting involved. And it's on all of us as ACM members and computer scientists and designers more broadly to get involved, take the opportunity to get involved in this rulemaking and make a big difference. We'll talk more during the panel about how to do that. But I think it's really important to understand that a lot of times the knowledge from the computing community is missing in the legal framework, right? And while for brilliant lawyers like Tim Elder, they understand all the different aspects of the legal framework. So, Tim understands, as do many disability rights lawyers, that the DOJ has been saying this for 25 years and that courts have said that. Yet for computer scientists, it's often harder to understand, well, what does the law say? What does it require? Are there technical standards? It's harder, even though there may be a lot of strength in the legal rules. If you don't come from a legal background, it can be more challenging to understand. So I think we have a great opportunity here to be involved with ACM and help inform the rulemaking process for Title II and the ADA. And I think it's on all of us to get involved and make sure that the best practices from computing inform this rulemaking. So excited to be here with this great panel today, and look forward to talking more and coming up with exciting paths forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan and Stephanie and Tim, for those great entry remarks. I will say, because Jonathan has claimed, I thought he was with me in the bucket of computer scientist, but since he claimed he's also a legal expert, I will say from the start that I'm not the lawyer in the room, so I'm the one least able to do that. But given that, let's start first with some background, because I know many of you in the audience are computer scientists. Only some of you are lawyers and policymakers. So let's start first with just a summary of some of the background on the landscape of laws that govern accessibility, and specifically tech and web-based accessibility. Tim, can you help us with that?
Sure, I'll try. I'll give 50 years of legal precedence development in like three minutes. Really quickly, the disability access started with civil rights movements in the 1970s, and through the Rehabilitation Act that was applied to government access. Then we decided, it's not just about intentional discrimination. There's actually things that can be unintentionally designed, and it's just thoughtlessness. So let's develop some standards about accessibility. And we started to see things like the ADA come online, where we said, look, we're going to make specific technical requirements. It's not about, nobody hates people with disabilities. I mean, for the most part, right? Like, it's not about intentional. It's just thoughtless design. Rather than designing something that can be accessible for everyone to use, people are assuming, a certain level of mobility or a certain level of reach or whatever. And so then we saw the ADA come into play, and that applied to the private sector in addition to government services. Then in the 90s, we started to see a lot of technology, and we said, well, a lot of this technology can apply to the accessibility standards as well. So we saw things like Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act added, where for the first time electronic information technology was covered explicitly. And then there were standards under the 508 standards that applied to electronic information technology used by governments or procured by governments. But what about all of this whole thing that we're all interested in, the internet? That came online, and then the question was, well, does the ADA apply to the internet? because the ADA typically applied to places of public accommodation. And so there were massive legal disputes sort of at the end of the 90s and into the 2000s about what does the ADA mean for websites and websites of places of public accommodation. For the most part, that's been settled that to some degree, the ADA does apply to websites, particularly websites of places of public accommodation, but there's disagreement about what about a web-only location? In some parts of the United States, that would be covered under the law. In other parts, there's a question. And we've also then seen the WCAG standard. So now the industry has a standard, but the law doesn't have a standard, at least for private websites. We've got WCAG. Everyone uses WCAG. Anyone who wants to build an accessible website or apply it to accessible web-based technology, they know that WCAG is a standard. Now we saw the Access Board, which adopts the 508 standards that apply to government procurement, that adopted WCAG. So now we've got WCAG in as a standard for the federal government. And then a lot of states actually piggyback on that and say, whatever the 508 standards are, anything in our state government has to follow that same standard. So the standards are there and they're partially implemented in a lot of places in the government, but probably the biggest coverage is private businesses under the ADA. And that's where we don't have technical standards that have been adopted. And that's why DOJ is finally moving to adopt some technical standards in the same way that we have these ADA physical standards for the size of a parking space or the scope of or the grade of a ramp. We need that for the markup on a website. And so that's kind of where we are in the history, sort of how we got here. And, you know, the law isn't necessarily waiting. We can bring website cases now, and the standard that the court's likely to use, or that the experts in the litigation are likely to use, will probably be WCAG, because that's what the industry has sort of accepted. But that doesn't mean that that is the legal standard to be, you know, mandated necessarily. So in all jurisdictions. So that's the gap, is why doesn't the law that covers the most things, the private ADA and Title II of the ADA and all these various titles, why don't we have regulatory technical standards that covers that very broad piece of statutory coverage? So, and now here we're finally about to see some activity in that regulatory space.
So Tim, let me follow up on this a little bit. So just last week, I'm sure you're aware, the Department of Justice released a report about compliance of federal government websites with Section 508 of the Rehab Act. And the takeaways were stark. First and foremost, it said only 1 in 10 public-facing websites at major federal departments and agencies are fully accessible for people with disabilities. It also mentioned government agencies not having adequate resources, committed, or staff trained. And importantly said that since the last report was released, which was 10 years ago, there'd been little change from that time. Is this a problem with compliance or what? Can you speak about that?
I can. I'm pretty active in the Section 508 litigation field, as small as it is. I think, yes, there's been a problem with compliance. And for a long time, that was due to a clog in the courts, where courts were saying that certain categories of people who wanted to complain about Section 508 violations couldn't bring those into court, that you had to file some sort of an administrative complaint with the agency, and then it would just sort of take that complaint and sit on it. It would just disappear into a black hole of administrative bureaucracy. Now, the DC Circuit just recently confirmed that no, those claims can go forward in court. And so I think we'll start to see some enforcement in the judiciary, where federal agencies are given a chance to correct their technology, and then they choose not to, or they don't do it. So I think that's good news, and we'll see more activity in the space. But yeah, the compliance is problem because a lot of the agencies, they weren't being held accountable, and the government, you know, I think the government also was sort of getting ripped off, where its vendors were just checking the box for accessibility, and then the government, you know, maybe not know that the thing that it has procured is inaccessible or not because someone checked the box, or there wasn't a strong enforcement compliance check. So okay, so the government finds out that the thing is not accessible. What do they do about that? And is there enough pressure from the enforcement to get them to convince them to actually take that seriously, and then, you know, follow up with the vendor or cancel the vendor's contract or do whatever it needs to do? So there's been a lack of enforcement, I think, has been the biggest problem in Section 508 compliance.
Okay, this is great. Jonathan, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to add something to this?
Absolutely. So what Tim is talking about is absolutely true, that 508 winds up being almost hidden, right? Is that you have agencies, federal agencies, who don't talk about their 508 compliance. They don't actually report data on it. They, you know, if you ask them, they'll give you no information. And maybe it was about 10 years ago, there was a group of disability rights lawyers who had to file a series of FOIA requests to find out more. And so often what you find is that the agencies, first of all, they're not checking for accessibility, so they're getting ripped off, as Tim mentioned. But also you find situations where the agency has a 508 coordinator, but it's someone who already has a full-time job, and just 508 coordinator is a title tacked on at the end. So they really don't have the time or the resources to actually build a 508 program within that agency. I mean, there are a few agencies that had some success with 508, but it's been an ongoing problem, and these levels haven't changed much. And of course, when DOJ isn't doing the data collection, right, and agencies aren't talking about 508, I mean, you have people like Tim who are in court who are really bringing attention to 508. Just want to highlight that the DOJ report only came out because of the efforts of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. And that Senate committee has recently gotten very involved with 508. And trying to bring attention to 508 and the issues there. So it's really, it's not even that DOJ necessarily was planning on doing it. It's that there was so much political pressure coming from the Senate Committee on Aging that brought attention to 508. So really a lot more attention needs to be paid to 508, because otherwise, you're right, there's almost no enforcement, there's no data, and it's kind of hidden away. And that's why, that's in my opinion, why I think 508 compliance has been so poor over the last, decade or so.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah,
So
and
Stephanie, oh, I'm sorry, Tim, were you saying something?
yeah, just one quick follow-up is
Yes.
I think also there's an issue where, because of the way technology is procured and the way it's developed, the government doesn't do a lot of stuff in-house these days. So in some ways, it's not the fairest situation in the world that the government should carry all the liability for Section 508 violations. I truly think that the vendors and contractors really need to be the one that are at the table, and and I think that'll increasingly that will be happening. So
that's an important comment to answer the question of who is responsible for compliance in there. And so it's not an easy answer, and that there are multiple stakeholders that share that responsibility and accountability and so forth. Great discussion. So let me bring Stephanie in. And Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to add to some of the earlier comments I made about DOJ rulemaking, and why is that important? And what do we need to understand about that process?
Sure. If I could also just add one little piece
Sure.
to the prior
Okay.
thread. I just wanted to underscore when Tim said that vendors aren't the ones that are on the hook for, accountability in this, and that obviously the government is relying heavily on contractors. Where we are migrating with this rulemaking to state and local governments, they may also be in the space of relying on contractors. And so an element of what's at play here is how to hold vendors accountable. And there is a piece of legislation that was introduced in the last session of Congress called the Website and Software Applications Accessibility Act that explicitly spells out that the creators of web-based services and products are actually held accountable. And so I just wanted to draw attention to that, and we may loop back to that because it is something that's still kind of left untouched in our current legal landscape in terms of the creators having some skin in the game. And so I will turn to the question that you really pointed me to, which is to talk about really where are we with what is forthcoming in this regulatory space. So I know Tim had given us that wonderful synopsis, and there's multiple titles of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I pertains to employment and employers. Title II is state and local governments, and Title III is places of public accommodation. So the regulations that are forthcoming are just on Title II. That's just state and local governments. And so what that means is, I'm just going to give you a flavor of what kinds of entities will be regulated by this. This is like local education agencies. It's publicly administered benefits like housing benefits, SNAP, unemployment, DMV, public transit services. So this is the landscape of who would be regulated. And really what we're looking for regulations to go ahead and address and really give clarity around could be questions or issues that are inclusive of whether there will be any exceptions for small businesses, whether WCAG standards will be used as a measure of compliance, what types of websites or web content would be covered, how web developers could approach large volumes of inaccessible content. And then, of course, what will the effective date be for these? In terms of process, what the DOJ needs to do to walk through a rulemaking is they first develop a proposed rule, and then they evaluate it in terms of its cost and benefits. Then, and this is the place that we are poised to be at together right now, they're about to introduce a public comment period where the public will be able to, respond to what they have proposed and provide comments. Then they will use those comments to craft a final rule. And then the DOJ, of course, gets to enforce this rule, as does the rest of the disability rights bar and people like Tim. And so from that perspective, we are at a spot where the Department of Justice has really moved from where they were during the Obama years, where they had the beginning of a rulemaking that did not, actually come to fruition. They used some of the pieces of that rule, and we only hope in the advocacy space that they begin to really think about it very holistically, and that they will deliver us in a public comment space a really healthy draft rule for all of us to be able to comment on. So.
Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. I am going to switch and probably come back to that when we seek some other clarification on really what we're talking about in terms of DOJ rulemaking. I'm going to turn now to a different question, a more specific question, and this might appeal to the technical people in our audience. And I'm going to ask Jonathan about this, but let me give a quick preamble to my question. So in our May letter to DOJ, the USTPC, the Technology Policy Committee, noted that the current guidance from DOJ fails to address many more technical but critical web features of web accessibility. Things like flashing content, audio description, status messages. That's just a short list of many. So we talk about visibility, navigability, interfaces, and translation. So Jonathan, I'm going to ask you, what are the technical challenges that are presented in designing accessible technology? I know it's a wide question, so take a shot wherever you want. You are muted. You are muted.
Thank you. Sorry, got so excited to answer the question. So I think the first thing to consider is that, we often immediately go to these very theoretical examples of this futuristic technology and how would we do this, right? And we neglect the fact that there are so many barriers that exist now that we already have all of the technical solutions we need, right? And I point to, for instance, the case of Robles v. Domino's Pizza. So blind individual, Robles, sued Domino's Pizza because the website and the mobile app for Domino's Pizza were not accessible. Now think about this for a minute. Ordering a pizza. This is not advanced AI, right? This is a basic task. What are your choices here? What size pizza you want? Do you want the cheesy crust? What toppings do you want? Things like that. Not a complex task. Right? The expert witness in the case estimated that fixing the website and the mobile app would cost Domino's about $40,000, right? So very inexpensive. Why? Because ordering pizza is not that complex. $40,000. Domino's instead went on a 6-year-long legal battle, right? Including filing a cert petition asking the Supreme Court to overturn the right of anyone with a disability to have access to websites. So, we say kind of, where are the technical challenges? I say first, let's focus on why is it that we have not yet, right, solved all the low-hanging fruit with the technical standards we have, like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG or WCAG, right? Do we need some better tools for testing? Absolutely. Do we need better education so more computer scientists and designers graduate with expertise in web accessibility and other forms of digital accessibility? Yes. Right? Do we need to figure out clearer guidance on when and how to do various forms of like usability testing, manual inspections, automated tools? Yes. But I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the barriers that exist now are ones that we already have the technical solutions for, using the guidelines and the expertise and the knowledge that we have. And so when we immediately jump to where are the technological challenges, right? We miss the fact that there is this broad area that is solvable right now with the expertise that we have right now, right? And are there some areas that researchers are working on? Yes, absolutely. Things like accessible data science and ensuring that, AI is not discriminatory. But there's this wide swath of things that are solvable now using all the technologies that we have. And you see this again and again, where these companies say, I would rather fight a lawsuit, right? And keep fighting rather than say, well, why don't I just make it accessible? So I want to go with the advice of disability rights lawyer Lainey Feingold, who said, always hire computer scientists instead of lawyers. It costs much less money, right? Fix the website, fix the app, make it accessible. And so we always want to emphasize what's already solvable. And yes, we're working on futuristic solutions and we continue to do important research, but let's focus on the fact that there's so much that's solvable that is not yet solved. And what do we need to do as a computing community to inform more companies? Why is it that they do not think of people with disabilities as consumers, right? There's a great example from a few years ago of Peapod, a grocery delivery app, right? This was around 2014, so grocery delivery. Peapod would not make their website and app accessible. They were forced to by the DOJ. Now, Peapod was in the business of grocery delivery. That seems like people with disabilities, a lot of people with disabilities might be interested in grocery delivery because of transportation challenges or personal mobility challenges. Yet Peapod didn't understand the consumer opportunity, the business opportunity. And I think that that's really important, that businesses don't understand the consumer business opportunity, right? And instead they say, we can't fix our website, we're a mobile app, it's so expensive, right? And businesses don't focus on the benefits the businesses have, and also don't focus on the impact on people with disabilities. And that's one of the great things about a rulemaking process, right? Rulemaking processes are exciting. I know you think a computer scientist excited about rulemaking, but they really are. Because when you do a rulemaking process, there's what's known as a regulatory impact analysis. And that takes into account the impact on all stakeholders. It's not just businesses and their cost to modify their website. It's also the impact on users with disabilities. And you measure that. For instance, we did a study where there were, we had blind users attempting to complete tasks on a high accessibility website that actually was compliant with WCAG 2.1, and a website that had some accessibility barriers, but it was still technically doable, even though it had some accessibility barriers. It took blind users 5 times more time to complete the tasks, right? If full accessibility was not there. So a regulatory impact analysis incorporates that type of information, incorporates the viewpoint of users with disabilities, consumers with disabilities. And so I always like moving to a more holistic discussion, because that helps frame why we do rulemaking and why it's so important that as computer scientists and designers and others in the tech space that we really fully engage with this. This is an opportunity to have the right knowledge informing the rulemaking process.
Okay, so great. I appreciate that holistic process, but I do want to still try to see if I can get some more detailed information. Tim, I know earlier you were eager to speak on this particular issue as well. Anything you want to add to what Jonathan has covered?
I mean, it's a complex problem, and with any complex problem, from a technologist perspective, like let's put the law aside, the law will come out, we'll have technical standards that will be helpful, but it'll be minimum standards, right? You know, you want the experience for your customer or for your user to be like as good as possible, not, you know, the minimum standard. So I think there's some other things to think about, and there's some exciting things to look at in this same field about how do we excel, and what kind of what does the user experience look like? You know, I even and I think there's space for innovation, not just on the web developer side, but on the screen reader assistive technology side, right? Because computers were not usable by blind people without relying on like someone sighted to key things in and read things on the screen, this screen reader technology was invented to verbalize the text on the screen in a synthesized voice. So what further advances might come out in the next decade to have more robust screen readers, or voice control, or voice activation, or hybrid systems that allow for alternative forms of access? Certainly these standards are good, and we need to follow them to create minimum level of access. But I also think there's, for the computer, you know, scientists, and for the problem solvers in the room, there's a lot of opportunities to look at this, not just from the technology design, but also from the user experience side, or even the user tool side. So it's, I mean, there's a lot of ways and frankly, the level of accessibility is so low in many areas that we're going to have to attack this problem from all angles, right? Not just the design stage, but also from the use stage.
Okay, so thank you, Tim. Let me take a quick break and note for the audience that we are going to continue our discussion with the panel for about 15 more minutes, but we are watching for questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A button to provide that. And then when we come to that particular point in time, we're going to turn to some of those questions that have come up. So let me skip a few things, and I'm going to, in the interest of holistic and some other ways of approaching these questions and problems, I'm going to jump to a question of, because Jonathan introduced it already, but this is really for Jonathan or Stephanie or Tim who want to answer this. Oftentimes we hear people talking about concerns about the cost of designing and providing for accessibility, and that it might be a significant deterrent to compliance. Jonathan talked about an issue with Domino's Pizza. And so the larger question, we think, is that what is the cost of not providing accessibility? And so I know, again, this is a big question, but it's whether it's cost to those with disabilities, to businesses, to society, really a very large frame on how do we address this particular question.
Stephanie, do you want to go first, since I already started talking a little bit about this issue?
Yes. Stephanie or Tim? Okay, you are still muted.
I'll let Stephanie.
All right, sure. So one of the things that AFB is currently researching is looking at this exact issue. And I can't truly spell out what our research that has not yet been published says, but we will have some very compelling answers to what happens to blind and low vision consumers who are using assistive technology when they're faced with inaccessible websites and applications. Do they, what do they resort to? And what is the cost? And I'll just give you a hint that the business community will want to know what the answer is. So I think that there is going to be something in that it's costing business, good business category. So I know that in terms of the other impacts, there's obviously impacts to the disability community itself, to the individuals that are excluded in terms of their ability to interface with, whatever that product or service or thing is in the digital environment. And so that kind of exclusion has impacts in that space as well that I really think are very important to note, because our world will only become more and more dependent on technology in this space. So I'll leave it there. But I do want to just prime that you should watch our research space because it will be a very interesting research.
Great.
Okay, and just so you know, we have clipped in afb.org on the chat, and just a call for the audience to pay attention to that. Jonathan, did you want to speak again, or Tim, did you have something to say here? Okay, go ahead.
I'm happy to chat more. Tim, do you have more you want to add, or?
No, go ahead. I'll
Okay.
speak after you.
Okay. So, I gave a few examples already about pricing discrimination and things of that nature, employment discrimination. But, think during the COVID pandemic, how many of the vaccine registrations online were inaccessible, right? For a lot of governments and pharmacies, right? The signups for COVID vaccine registrations were inaccessible. So it's not just that we're talking about sort of as if it wasn't enough, right? So employment and education and commerce. We're also talking about healthcare, medical records that are inaccessible. And so much of our world now relies on online access. And, a lot of employment places haven't gone back to full in-person, right? So we're still doing commerce. We're doing all these different things fully online. So there is a barrier every step of the way, right, in daily life for people with disabilities. I want to refer something computer science professor at University of Washington, Richard Ladner said. He said, people with disabilities make great computer scientists. Why? Because every single day there are problems and barriers, and they have to come up with workarounds and kludges and fixes, right? And so very creative, right, and really good at problem solving, right? Years ago, we did a study measuring the frustrations that blind people face online with websites. And actually, there were certain categories where blind people were better than people without any disabilities, visual people, at solving problems. And when I spoke to a few of my blind colleagues, they're like, right, because we do problem solving like that every day. So, I think there really is the need to get more people with disabilities into computing as a profession. And certainly there are efforts like the Teach Access effort and a few others broadening participation and such. But, it's just really important to keep in mind that impact, right? Getting access to your medical records, commerce, all of these things are barriers on a daily basis that impact the quality of life.
So these are great comments. I'm going to flip the question a bit. So we talk about cost and barriers and obstacles and challenges, but what if we talk instead about what kinds of incentives, what kind of carrots can we offer to people in addition to regulatory oversight and stick to provide incentive to do better on accessibility?
So I'm happy to address that. The issue of cost or incentive is a really interesting one. I would say, at least as to cost, going back to that, what is the cost of complying with a building standard? I don't know. What's the, how much do you save if you build a building that meets the building code and follows the architectural standards versus one that doesn't? I don't know the cost differential, but I can tell you, what is the difference when you look at the earthquake in Turkey and what happened to some of those buildings and the life that's been lost, and a lot of it attributed to lack of building something in the best way you can. It's just something to think about. Incentives are good too, though. I think if building things in the best way that you can, in the way that is most inclusive, has some built-in incentives. If you build an accessible website, you're building something that's very likely to also have search engine optimization. If you build an accessible website, you're also likely getting it ready for whatever artificial intelligence powered user interface is coming next. If a screen reader can control the website, a voice controlled assistant probably could do the same thing. So I think as we are all wanting to be more flexible in how we access information and have a customer or a user experience, following those minimum standards for accessibility, you're in some ways you're future-proofing and building in flexibility into your user interface. And that will allow it to keep up with new forms of interaction and have all kinds of other benefits. Are there other incentives? Yeah, there's goodwill. Like we can talk about that all day long, but you know, when you wonder what goes on behind the closed curtain and in the boardroom, and when someone's looking at return on investment and the you know, whether something is worth cutting or doing it cheaply or cutting a corner, you know, I think the law, the incentive of the law and trying to get people to do the right thing is useful. But again, the law, I don't think can incentivize as well. Maybe we can do tax credits or something like that. But the real incentive is, like, as a culture and as a society, do we want to be proud and build good things that are well built, or we just want cut corners and build things as cheaply and quickly as we can? I mean, it's a constant struggle, I think, in society for what kind of standards do we want for goods and how do we price for that?
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to ask, I see, Jonathan, you had your hand raised. Did you want to make, if you could make just a brief comment, then I'm going to ask you more question. Go ahead.
Just a brief follow-up on what Tim said. There's actually a fairly large body of research about how accessible interfaces actually are easier to use for the broad population. So it's helping all of your consumers. And Domino's, in a comical way, even brought home that point in one of their briefs where they said it wasn't discriminating against blind people because actually their website and mobile app were very hard to use for everyone. Everyone is frustrated and found it hard to use. So it's not discrimination. You know, blind people suffer like everyone else. It's like, okay, well, wouldn't you want to fix that so you could start selling more pizzas?
Okay, great. So let me turn to one more question, and then we have about 6 audience questions. So I'm going to get to those after we answer this one last question I'd like to pose. ACM is a society in the profession of designing computing spaces. So I'd like to discuss how we can better change education and tools and resources for our professional members who are charged with designing accessible technology. So Jonathan, would you like to take a stab at that, or really Tim and Stephanie, if you want to answer as well, based upon your experience with this?
I'm happy to answer. Tim or Stephanie, would you like to go first?
Oh, go ahead.
No. Okay. I think something that's really important for us to consider as computing educators is that accessibility concepts need to be included throughout the curriculum, not just as an add-on at the end. So in a lot of undergraduate and graduate curriculum, you learn all of the different aspects of computing. Then in your final course, right, you learn, oh, by the way, there's accessibility. Here's what you do. And so it sets up in the minds of students and later alumni this idea that you build technology and then you retrofit it for accessibility if you do. And of course, we know from lots of research that that's the wrong way to do it. That's the more expensive way to do it. If you use a born accessible approach, accessibility costs are minimal, as Tim was describing with buildings. But if you go back, right, after you've built something and try to retrofit it for accessibility, it can significantly add to the coding. right? And so why is it we're teaching accessibility at the end and not at the beginning and throughout a program? So this idea of kind of injecting accessibility throughout the curriculum is similar to the idea of kind of injecting security throughout all of the courses you take in computing. There's one University of Dundee in Scotland, that's done work on how you kind of incorporate accessibility as modules kind of inserted in every course. So people see accessibility as kind of just a part of normal coding standards and a part of normal software development and hardware development. And so I think really that's the key, is getting people away from that model of retrofitting, which makes it more expensive. And also between the time that a technology is released and the time that it's retrofitted, there's also a gap there where people with disabilities won't have access to whatever that software, website, or interface is. So that's yet another form of discrimination. But I really think as educators, and there's some great efforts, I'll mention like Teach Access, right? The organization Teach Access, to get more content about digital accessibility into curriculum. So I think that's the most important thing we can do: inject accessibility throughout the curriculum, not just at the end, and try to teach the Born Accessible model, which is the easier and least expensive way to do accessibility and doesn't set up that time lag.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Stephanie, you, Tim, do you?
Yeah,
I see Tim.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I agree with all that. I think, there's also a lot of opportunity here for students in this next generation of computer scientists to try to solve some of the problems, and particularly the scaling problem. Right now, accessibility remediation, accessibility testing, accessibility remediation, it's very manual, and there's an opportunity to try to scale automation. Now, you have to be careful because, as we all know, automation can go wrong. But I think we're getting to a place where we ought to be thinking about how to design things that have built-in automation and checks, both when you're designing a website. I mean, we figured out spell check. I mean, people are still able to make spelling errors, but for the most part, with text prediction and auto spell checking and things, it's greatly reduced. Well, one would think the number of errors, right? But like, why can't we incorporate that into a lot of the coding systems? And I'm not a coder. I don't write the language out or deal with those kind of interfaces. But it seems to me like the academy and education and students who are looking for problems to solve, there's some really interesting problems in the field of accessibility to innovate. Like it's ripe for innovation for the right scientist, I think.
Wonderful.
This is Stephanie. Just to echo a little bit of what's been said here, as I'm thinking about the whole landscape that it will take to travel through, to be able to get to a place where accessibility is something that has been fully realized for people with disabilities, there is all of the policy stuff and the legal stuff that we're addressing today, we're talking about. But once we have that regulation clarity and the legal framework, has that, defined standard that people have to meet, we have that huge accessibility knowledge gap that really has to be completely traversed for us to have real systemic change in this space. And so this is a problem of knowledge that will really truly need to be fully shored up for people with disabilities to have real equity in the digital environment. So I'm looking at this as a multifaceted problem that technologists and the academy related to technology will also have to be really invested in for us to get to a place of equity.
Excellent point. So thank you all for that. So let me turn now, a little bit early, but let me turn now because we built up some audience questions and some of them are quite specific. I'm going to start with the first one and I think Stephanie might be the right person to answer this. And this question is, give me a moment because I don't have my glasses on, it's very tiny text. Often 508 compliance is cut out of federal contracting budgets. do you see the new DOJ efforts helping to improve the budget for 508 for vendor contracts going forward?
Improve the budget for 508. What was?
Vendor contracts moving forward. I think it's addressing the fact that this has been cut out of the budget for contractors. And so he's asking, or he or she is asking, whether or not this DOJ rulemaking might address the fact that there's a need for a line item in the budget to address accessibility.
Well, I think that one of the things that's really interesting about the 508 report that was recently released is that, there was quite clear evidence that the staffing resources dedicated to 508 really truly seemed to be making some sort of a difference in how the compliance was working. And so I don't think that DOJ is literally going to, specify something that would be binding on state and local agencies related to, how they have to staff something, but they will have things in it related to procurement, most likely. And so from that standpoint, that at least gives them kind of some of the building blocks of being able to work with, let's say, those outside contractors. I mean, ultimately, if you are interfacing with the federal government and, you are a contractor, you have to, comply with their underlying obligation of accessibility. And I know we touched on it earlier, and it's complicated as to whether or not, an agency even has the staff to check. And when I was, to be totally honest, I was a federal employee for more than a handful of years. And even though it was not my wheelhouse, as the only blind person in my federal agency, I ended up happening to check something because it was a project I was on, and found that we were getting products from contractors that were wildly inaccessible. And it was only because I happened to be kind of close to what was going on that was even discovered and saved us from, getting these goods from a contractor. So, just because 508 tells us that, it needs to be compliant, and just because we will walk through a rulemaking process for state and local governments that will also, explicitly, regulate the way that they do business in an accessible manner, I don't think that there's going to be the level of detail that you may be alluding to that really actually says, well, you need to have a certain amount of staffing resources, or you need to do X, Y, or Z in terms of like how you actually achieve that. And I am nervous as an advocate as to how really small entities, because we could be talking about very, very small entities at like a local level, how they will also staff what their requirements will be when they have these regulations in their hands, because it's very likely that they will also have someone have this accessibility requirement piece as part of many different things that they have to do. It might only be like a fraction of their job. And we've seen in the federal space how that has worked and not worked. And, I do have concerns about how that will translate to a state and local environment as well.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie.
So this Tim, I will say, again, kind of going back to the point of like, is it fair to put all of the responsibility on the government, right?
Yeah.
It's really the vendors. They're the ones designing the technology. And so you can put terms in a contract that shift that responsibility to the vendor. And so I think increasingly the government will need to, beef up those contractual terms so that vendors really have, penalties and consequences when they don't deliver, because they'll just check if it's they might just check the box and deliver the widget, and and then they're on to the next contract, and the government's the one left holding the widget and responsible. So I know that GSA has done work in this space for federal procurement. I know that many states have stock language about contract enforcement and how to have really robust protections, liquidated damages, indemnity. I mean, there are ways to handle this through contract, and some government entities are doing it in various ways. And I imagine finding some best practices and some best contractual terms, and then using those would help.
Thank you, Tim and Stephanie both. Let me raise another question from the audience. This is perhaps technical. The question is, what do you think about the, in quotes, accessible argument trying to put an overlay on websites instead of simply doing the work at the root of design and coding? Can these Band-Aids be noted as not appropriate? Who would
So,
like to answer that?
I'm happy to address the overlay question. So the overlays don't work. The ones that I have seen, they don't. They certainly don't relieve you of ADA liability, and it seems to be a bit of a scam where for just $9.99 a month, you too can have an ADA compliant website, and it's just not that simple. And there's some questionable marketing practices happening in the space. It's new. I will say I am interested in the idea of a technology that solves accessibility problems at the user side, as long as the user has control of that, and there's not exploitation or privacy or other problems happening with the technology. But I don't think the overlay technology that we've seen on the market is going to fix ADA violations. The instances that I've seen sometimes either make the website a website that was not that was somewhat usable, less usable. So it can actually interfere with it, and it depends heavily on how often the website is updated, and does the overlay adapt to that update? So it creates some pretty big problems. So I don't endorse or recommend it as a way towards compliance. There's probably some situations where an overlay, well, it doesn't hurt anything. But I think there are some situations where it can hurt things. So you have to be really, really careful. The better solution, rather than trying to, construct a cardboard scaffolding up to the door of your building, much better to just build a permanent structure and fix it and put a ramp in, right? That's permanent. Great,
thank you, Tim. So I have a follow-up question, I think, Stephanie, to what you were discussing earlier about DOJ and funding solutions. Give me some time to read through that. So the question is, I would like to see GSA be given funds to hire and train a team of PWDs who can assist federal agencies with testing products and services acquired, because often testing with tools, often testing with tools do not get fully accurate results. So it's a testing technology question. Will the DOJ rulemaking include some sort of recommendations or allowance to give funding to stand up and make available a group of testing resources? Do you think this is possible? So really, any of you, whether Stephanie, you want to answer?
Sure. Okay. I don't think that DOJ will be kind of addressing the funding piece of all of it, because DOJ's role is to really provide that clarity related to the kinds of things that I listed off a bit earlier in our talk today, that give, it's like the guardrails of what people in a state or a local entity would need to do to be able to meet an accessibility standard. And so they don't have, let's say, funding to deploy to it, and they won't even necessarily address I can't think of any situation where they would address the funding aspect of it either. They would address or could the procurement aspects of it. We talked about that there has to be really strong procurement language to be able to allow them to contract out for certain things. A state and local entity may need to contract out for all kinds of things because of the size of their own internal resources. So they may speak to the strength of or something related to details related to procurement language. But I think that that's about as close as they'd be able to get in the financial realm. So that's where I'll answer that question.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks,
so
Stephanie.
this is Tim. I'll add to that. Yeah, at the moment we're in a reality where everything needs to be manually tested. There's no automated testing tool, and manual testing can be expensive. Probably the best place to put that cost is on the developer. It'll get, if testing is required, it'll get factored into the price of the government contract. But I do think that there's something to be said, and maybe states will pick this up. Like it might be worth a state setting up some kind of a certification body where, rather than having, the Environmental Protection Agency and HUD and Department of Justice and the Wyoming Park Service all doing their own independent tests of this same, enterprise technology that everyone is using, rather than having everyone doing their own testing and duplicating efforts, have one entity or one body do the testing with, really robust manual testers, and certify that version of the technology as passing a manual usability test. So that way, you can kind of maintain a certificate program for certain technology. There's a lot of pitfalls there to watch out for. But that might, now this is, futuristic, and what could we do differently in government? We're not doing this now. We are seeing that kind of happen in the area of K-12 educational technology, where for privacy, in order to sell that technology to elementary schools, you have to get this certificate of it complies with the privacy laws. And how could we do something similar for accessibility? Because we're not using our testing resources efficiently at the moment.
Excellent. So I think that's a good approach on here. I want to ask one more question. We do have time for one more. So briefly, this particular audience member is asking basically, so do we have to depend on the primary solution being regulatory action? Are there actions that you would recommend to individuals or to organizations who are interested in providing more accessible services sooner? So it's a impatience with the regulatory process, and what can we do now? That's the gist of the question. Anybody want to take a stab at this?
This is Stephanie. I'll just say, WCAG has been around for quite a while, and we could all basically tailor our web and internet-based services around what its parameters clearly state. So it's something that we can pick up now and do now, and that would mean that we are quite accessible. So
I would echo that. There's no secret on the how, right? YCAG standards are there. The Section 508 standards are there for information and communications technology. The standards are there. The only difference is which entities are they legally mandated for as a regulatory requirement. I can tell you where it's likely going. If anyone came to me and said, "Gee, Tim, my business is, we want to invest in this product. Where do you think it's going to go?" You would just look at the standards that are applied to the government now, because eventually that's going to be the standard applied to private sector. And that's been historically true for every disability statutes. Like at first, the government applied the law to itself, and then eventually those standards were ported over to apply to private business. And I think I have no reason to doubt that that's going to be different in the accessibility space, for digital accessibility space.
Thank you.
I think,
just real quickly.
Yep. I think often we miss the opportunity to work at a state level. We often think only of federal, federal regulations and federal statutes, But, a lot of disability rights activists are active at their state level, and it's much easier to get either new regs or new legislation. I mean, for instance, in the state of Maryland, in the last 2-3 years, there are 2 new statutes related to procurement of accessible digital technology by the state government, and also by procurement of accessible K-12 technology, right? So related to what Tim was saying about K-12 technology. And for instance, the K-12 one includes an indemnification clause requirement. So procurement contracts, in terms of Tim's point about putting it on the vendor, the procurement contracts are required to include an indemnification clause so that the vendor is on the hook if in any way the Board of Education or the local school gets sued because the technology is inaccessible, right? Put that responsibility, indemnification clauses in procurement contracts, put that responsibility on the vendor, and work at the state and local level also, where sometimes you can get much quicker action.
Wonderful. So let's then get some final takeaway from each of you. If each of you, one by one, would briefly comment on, so where do we go from here? What do you see as the most important issue to be addressed in the near future in order to strengthen web accessibility? I'll start with you, Jonathan, since you're still there.
Sure. I think, first of all, as people involved in computing, or many of us are ACM members as well, it's really important to get involved in ACM's efforts in this area, but also to get ACM to take a leadership role. I would love to see, the head of ACM always talking about accessibility. Can we talk about accessibility as much as we talk about AI? How great would that be, right? So ACM should take a leading role. ACM should require every single document, every single paper put out by every single ACM conference should be accessible. We know that's not the case right now, right? And think about it. I talked earlier about the importance of having many more computer scientists and designers with disabilities, right? If you want to study computing, you need to have accessible resources about computing to study computing, right? So if we are not having ACM generate completely 100% accessible educational materials, research articles, that is serving as a barrier to keeping out potential computer scientists with disabilities. So while we're talking at the kind of federal level, and I've argued for the state level as well, let's not forget that part of bringing more attention to this is by growing a community of students, of future programmers and developers and designers who are familiar with accessibility. And part of that is on ACM. So let's not only push the DOJ and inform the rulemaking, let's also push ACM to take a leading role in this area. Thank you.
Excellent point, Jonathan. Daphne, would you like to go next?
Sure, absolutely. I think that the moment that we're in, where we are about to be able to comment publicly on what the Department of Justice puts out as a potential rule, is a really important moment, because all of us, meaning every member of ACM and others, will be able to really weigh in on what they see in that rule. Will it be explicit? Will it actually spell out that it also applies to applications instead of only websites? Things like this are things that we can all comment on. Will it address procurement in the way that we have talked about today? Will there be really aggressive requirements related to timing or volume of content or emerging technologies? All of this is content that could really be fleshed out. And if it is not, it's on all of us to ask the questions that prompt DOJ to add to or amend what they have in their rule for the public to comment on. So all of us need to be political actors, and I call on all of us to do that. I think that the vendor piece that we've also talked about today is a very important one. And it's because in our current federal legal landscape, we don't have, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, really squarely placing the requirement on the shoulders of the vendors. And in many cases, the vendors are the key player in all of this. And so I want us to collectively think about this and continue conversations around how do we get to a spot where vendors really understand that responsibility, that take it on. And I do advocate for having a federal piece of legislation like the Website and Software Applications Accessibility Act that really does squarely put them on the hook for the procurement piece and the role that they play. And so I think that we should have a focus on the whole supply chain, so to speak, related to all of our content development. So
Two great
that's it.
points. Thank you, Stephanie. So Tim, last.
Yeah, just really quick, I will say, legal compliance should not be the goal here, right? That should be the minimum assumption. We should be shooting for better user experiences and fully inclusive programs and technologies that are as equally usable, not just legally accessible. There's a distinction there. So let's not get too preoccupied by the regulations and sort of the legal minimum. Technology can be so much more. It can be designed to be, what we want it to be. I mean, I'm the litigator or the person with the most litigation, work here. And I'm the one telling you, law and litigation is not going to be the answer. It is an inefficient process to enforce compliance. It has its purpose. We'll do it when we need to. We'll do it with impact, and it'll happen, and it'll cost you a lot if you don't do it. But it's not the thing that should be motivating the bulk of our conversation and the majority of our efforts.
Thank you. So outstanding closing comments. And so what I want to give a huge thanks to our panelists. I found this myself very informative, engaging, and we very much appreciate the expertise that all three of you have brought to this discussion today. I do also want to thank the members of the Accessibility Committee for helping to create this webinar, and especially its chair, who you heard from at the beginning of the discussion, for his continued attention to the issues and his expertise. And then finally, thank you to the audience today. We had some great questions. As USTPC members, we welcome ACM members who are interested in accessibility, technology, and policy to join us in our work as we move forward. You can reach out to our director, Adam Eisgrau, at acmpo@acm.org. Thank you and have a wonderful day.